There is a reason why the Bible tells us the story of the Tower of Babel. We like to tell ourselves that regime change is something that can succeed because people will simply like to live under liberal democracy. A number of people who support a more active foreign policy like to point to the example of World War II. They say America had successful regime change attempts in Japan and in Germany after the Second World War. A major difference, of course, between what happened in those countries after World War II and what's happened more recently is that both Japan and Germany War, what is it good for? That was a chant and a song in the 1970s. And once again, it is a question that many Americans are asking themselves as we contemplate the prospect of the United States getting involved in the conflict between Israel and Iran. America's experience of foreign conflicts in the last 20 years has been almost uniformly negative. And in fact, I think it has been entirely disappointing and disillusioning, and in fact, quite radicalizing to our own politics at home. We have obviously had to respond to the 9/11 attacks in 2001. We went to war with the Taliban in Afghanistan. But of course, that wound up becoming a 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, where once we changed the regime in Afghanistan, once we deposed the Taliban, we were unsuccessful in setting up a pro-American regime that would be capable of sustaining itself. And so we had to remain in the country for 2 decades. When we left, the country immediately reverted to Taliban control. That's about as tremendous a failure as could possibly be imagined in terms of regime change and foreign policy. Similarly, in Iraq, we didn't have quite the same degree of reversion to Saddam Hussein or the status quo before we had our war. But there, too, we wound up being, I think, very disappointed by the outcome of American intervention against Saddam Hussein. We deposed Saddam Hussein. We replaced him with a rather rickety attempt at a new government. And what happened was that Iraq was plunged into a civil war for many years. It was extremely bloody. At the end of that civil war, you wound up with a rather weak state, which is vulnerable to all sorts of extreme influences and hostile influences. The Iraqi state has, in fact, been easily influenced by Iran, which is now, of course, the nation that both the U.S. and Israel are most concerned about. Hello, I'm Daniel McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, one of the first and finest conservative publications, dating all the way back to 1957. It was founded by Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind. But from the beginning, Modern Age has also addressed American foreign policy and America's place in the world. In fact, our inaugural issue in 1957 included an essay by Felix Morley asking whether America was a republic or an empire. This is a question we continue to ask not only in the print magazine, which is published every 3 months, and to which you should subscribe, you'll very much enjoy it, but also on our website, modernagjournal.com, where we have new content every day, every workday, and where, in fact, we have both the best of American conservative thought in culture and in philosophy, as well as addressing the deeper considerations behind the headlines, whether that's in foreign policy or domestic policy. Now, President Trump came to office as someone who is seen as being an opponent of these failed American wars, these forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and potentially other wars in the future that might involve nation building and prolonged occupations and the same sorts of regime change operations that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that really have proved to be extremely difficult to accomplish if they can be accomplished at all. A number of people who support a more active foreign policy like to point to the example of World War II. They say America had successful regime change attempts in Japan and in Germany after the Second World War. A major difference, of course, between what happened in those countries after World War II and what's happened more recently is that both Japan and Germany faced a choice, and they made a choice for themselves. Their choice was either to be part of America's new post-war coalition, in the case of West Germany, in the case of Japan, or instead they could have chosen, having had the imperial regime in Japan destroyed and the Nazi regime in Germany destroyed, instead of siding with America, they had the choice of siding with the Soviet Union. Now, this was a choice that the Germans, the West Germans in particular, and the Japanese made for themselves, but it was an easy choice, precisely because the option of being Sovietized, having to go along with the communist bloc, or going along with the American bloc, was really a choice which was easily going to be made in favor of America. So keep in mind, this was not a case where America simply went in and micromanaged West Germany and Japan. We certainly did a fair bit of that, but what really made the regime change stick in Japan and in West Germany was the fact that they preferred to adopt the American model rather than the alternative model that was available at that time, which was the Soviet and the communist model. I mean, the Japanese could see what was happening right across, in China, and they did not want to follow that path. They did not want to see a much more profound kind of regime change and a more thoroughgoing revolution that would have taken place if Japan had had a communist movement take root that would have destroyed everything that was traditional about the country. Whereas America actually showed a way to preserve much of Japanese culture. And of course, we showed a way for Japan to regain its strength very quickly and become, in fact, one of our leading rivals economically in the 1980s. And similarly with West Germany. West Germany, too, said that between having a Soviet occupying army right across the way in East Germany and having Americans present in the West and having the option of joining the West rather than joining the communist bloc, it was much better to be part of the West because that would actually preserve much of German civilization. So there's nothing quite like that, either in the case of the recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq or what's happening in Iran now. We like to tell ourselves that regime change is something that can succeed because people will simply like to live under liberal democracy. And there is this widespread belief among American intellectuals that liberal democracy is the end of history. And what that means is that it's the goal of history. It's not that wars stop, it's not that events stop happening, but rather that history has a goal and a purpose, and that purpose is to live under a liberal democracy of the kind that these intellectuals believe that America itself has. This view, which is promulgated by Francis Fukuyama and others, is very much mistaken. In fact, what we see in the 21st century is that it's not regimes, it's not ideas, it's not intellectual notions of communism or capitalism, it's not liberal democracy versus dictatorship or other abstractions. What is most important in terms of war in the 21st century are peoples and place, territory and populations. Peoples all around the world, and this has been true for over a century, do not want to be ruled by foreigners, and they do not want to be ruled by puppet governments at home that are in fact controlled by foreigners. Now, in the 20th century, many historians would say that communism was the most powerful, dangerous idea of that 100 years. A historian by the name of John Lucas, a very important conservative Hungarian thinker, said that this was not the case, that in fact, the greatest force in history in the 20th century was not communism, it wasn't Nazism or totalitarianism, it was nationalism. Now, Lukács was a very strong critic of nationalism. He was very worried about it, but he admitted its power. And he thought that Lenin, perhaps, the great and terrible Soviet statesman who builds the Soviet Union, the revolutionary, he thought that Lenin was in fact less the sort of exemplary and terrifying revolutionary of the 20th century than Woodrow Wilson. That Woodrow Wilson, in fact, by bringing about a attempt at creating an international order that was going to promote various forms of internationalism, that had failed, and that in fact nationalism wound up being the successful ideology really across the world. Not only an ideology, but a practice grounded in, again, people and place, in territory and population. The success of nationalism simply springs from the fact that people want to be ruled by people like themselves as opposed to foreign influences. Now, if that's the case, then nation building and regime change are always going to have a very limited degree of success, or perhaps in the long run, they're in fact going to end in complete abject failure. And our own experience of the last 20 years certainly suggests they will end in failure. Because again, we can't simply go into a foreign country such as Iran and tell them what form of government they're going to have, because that form of government will be seen as being something that is imposed by foreigners, that is answerable to foreigners, that is responsive to Israel, perhaps responsive to the United States, but not responsive to the actual culture and habits of the Iranians themselves. And this is not to say that, Iranians or Chinese people or people anywhere else in the world, that they love tyranny, that they want to have theocratic governments or communist governments or various kinds of illiberal and undemocratic governments. But they will oftentimes accept even a local form of tyranny rather than have a foreign form of supposed freedom. This also applies, of course, to the West itself, and it applies to Europe, and indeed it applies to the United States. When we look at disputes over immigration, disputes over American culture, American history, American heroes, all of these involve the question of what is responsive to the American people or the people of the nations of Europe, and what is in fact an ideology that is adopted by an elite, but really is a kind of alien viewpoint to which the people of these nations are now expected to conform. And so when you look at foreign policy, you see this paralleled. You see that there is a tendency for elites, both in the United States and in Europe, to favor various kinds of internationalism, to favor various universal designs of human rights, to favor this idea of an end of history leading all nations to liberal democracy, and this notion that this end of history has to be midwifed by European and now especially American power going in and destroying rogue states and creating new, fresh liberal democracies in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and now perhaps Iran. All of this is delusional, and all of this not only is getting foreign policy wrong, it's getting domestic policy wrong. Because what it is it's creating a greater and greater sense among the public that in fact these wars are being fought for foreign aims and for even by a leadership class in our own country, which basically thinks more about illegal aliens and thinks more about regime change in other countries than they think about the well-being and the increase and augmentation of the population of citizens right here at home. Donald Trump came to office because of the backlash against this more universalistic and more globalist kind of thinking, which was common, by the way, in both parties, but among the elite, both among Republicans and Democrats. If the Trump administration now gets involved in a war of regime change, a very prolonged war in some place like Iran, even if the polls say that this conflict may be popular at the start, even if the polls say, in fact, that it may be popular for some time, the ultimate effect of these kinds of wars, as we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, is going to be to drive a wedge farther and deeper between America's ruling class and the American people. That's because for us, as well as for foreign populations, the question that is most important is this good for our people? Does this make our people greater? Or are these conflicts being fought over abstractions, over ideas, and for the sake of foreign interests? In the pages of Modern Age and on our website, modernagejournal.com, we try to discuss the deeper layers of foreign policy, of the nature of not only our own government, but of regimes all around the world, and why it is so difficult to try to change these things by force, and why one people has a great deal of difficulty trying to impose its vision of the good on another. The world is divided up into nations. There is a reason why the Bible tells us the story of the Tower of Babel, where human hubris tried to create a universal order by building a tower up to heaven. And God took these people and gave them different languages, imposed different languages on them. That's the Babel of Babel. And as a result, God separated them into nations. And the idea of ever reconstituting a Tower of Babel, a single unitary order, even a single abstract unitary order, such as liberal democracy, to be instantiated in every part of the world, is just as hubristic as the construction of the Tower of Babel in the first place. You can read a great conservative philosopher by the name of Michael Oakeshott, who in fact has 2 essays using the Tower of Babel as the theme and symbol of human hubris in all sorts of political projects. And as we look at foreign policy today, we need to keep the lessons of the Tower of Babel in mind.